Chase will probably be behind you this way or whatever, but we just want to show people what hot is and what hot isn't. Then they go like this, ow.
Okay, we're live on Instagram.
You got calluses on your hands.
You get it over.
I got you, Chase.
I got you. Yes, sir. I got you.
What about audio, Matty boy?
Let me check.
Audio, check. Matt, can you hear me? Matt, check out my new car. Justin put doors and windows on it for me.
I got audio.
You got audio?
Yep.
Woo-wee, that's a good thing because I sure am excited to tell everyone about my new General. This thing is coming along nice. Full-on race prep, doors, AC. You know, the girl needs what she needs. We're here, Shock Therapy Live, and rumor has it we're going to talk about something hot.
We're definitely talking about something hot, Chase. It is not you.
Hey.
Well, sometimes Chase is pretty hot in his own mind, for sure.
Everyone's hot here in Arizona today.
That's right. It's 110 or 12 degrees today. So Tech Tuesday, you guys. Thanks for tuning in. About 5 minutes ago, we decided we're going to talk about this subject, so I might miss a few things. If you guys come up with stuff and ask questions, and I will try my best to answer. But what we're talking about is temp and temperature when it comes to shocks. A lot of people wonder what too hot is, or what too cold is, or if their shocks are working or functioning correctly according to the temperature. What we get a lot of is customers or non-customers will ask us, hey, I can touch the front shocks and they're just barely warm. I touch the rears and I can barely even touch them. They must be overheated. Well, nothing could be further from the truth, and we'll explain to you exactly why that is. So, where do we start? Temperature on shocks. Well, looking at the front shocks on the race car, front shocks have a really big advantage. They get a lot of air thrown across the front of them. So when you feel temperature on front shocks and you feel that it's cooler than the rears, that may not be because the shocks are working less or less hard. It might just be because they're getting a lot more airflow than the back. But what is good temp in a shock? Well, average or at least operating temperature on most shock absorbers is going to be between 160 degrees and 280 degrees, somewhere in that spot. If you have quality oil, then the shock will function the same throughout that whole temperature range. That is a very, very large range. That's going to be like barely you touch a shock and it's not going to be that warm, all the way up to touch the shock and burn your hands on it, to also say the 280 degree range where you touch the shock and leave your skin on it. So a lot of things go into this, a lot of different factors create this, but if we kind of narrow this down to like play cars. So if you're the guy that's in the trails and dunes and doing all the fastest rides possible, you can probably expect a 140, 50, 60 degree to 210 degree max. That's about what most customers are going to see. Remember, water boils on the low end of 200, so you probably aren't even to the point where you can throw some water on the shock and have the thing boil right off. And it's certainly not anywhere near to the direction or the range where you're going to have problems. When shocks get hot, or when shocks get up to temperature, there's a few things that happen. One, the oil can drop in viscosity. It can go from a 5 weight to a 3 depending on the oil. It can go from a 10 weight to a 7 depending on the oil. Quality of oil is huge, and honestly, most of the shocks that come on UTVs are being built according to the least expensive possible way for production reasons. So we're not getting the best oil in the factory shocks. So what you might see is you start off and the shocks are cold and it rides a certain way, and maybe it even rides perfect. Once you get the things up to operating temperature like 160 to 80 degrees, all of a sudden they run so much softer. They might even ride a little bit rougher in areas. Well, that doesn't mean that your shocks have faded. That means that your shocks have gotten up to temperature where they actually should be functioning, and the oil is a little bit on the lower side of quality and it's not giving you what that thing needs. So you're seeing fade in the shock just to get it to operating temperature. That's typical for factory stuff. When you start getting into more racing or you get inside the shock, if you send the shocks to us, then we're changing a lot of that. We're changing how that oil functions. We're changing the oil most of the time. Just depends on what the car requires to a higher grade of oil, where you might drive out of camp bone cold and it functions the same as it does when it's at 180 degrees. Typically that's a oil-based situation. Now, if you have the best oil, you have the best parts in the shock, and you're running 180 degrees and you run through a section of whoops that are about 100 miles long. Now this is a fictional situation for play cars, but it's normal for most race cars, where you're going to run a section that's to the horizon 3 times and it's nothing but whoops.
San Felipe.
San Felipe. Everybody talks about San Felipe being the roughest race on the calendar of any calendar. Well, it is, not because of the rocks, not because of the washouts, not because of any of those things, but because of 3-foot whoops for miles and miles, and I mean like 30 miles horizon, 30 miles horizon, another 100 miles of it over and over and over again. And that unrelenting abuse on a shock is where temperature comes from. Actually brings up another subject. So operating temperatures, 160 to 260, 280 in that range. What's too hot? Well, too hot is where the shock actually starts to break down components, and a lot of the parts on the shock, like say the head of the shock and other parts, are held in place with Loctite. Loctite melts at 300 degrees. So if you ever get the shock to 300 degrees, you're going to start melting adhesion. You're going to start losing parts because they're going to loosen up. And that's when shock parts fail. You're not going to actually blow it up. You're not going to light the oil on fire. You're not going to have any of those things happen. It's just going to lose parts that are actually bolted to the shock and have the thing fail. I have a story about that. So we took our Turbo XP Razor to San Felipe prior to a race, and we used it as a pre-runner. So we went down through all the roughest stuff, had standard shock on it, and I've got temperature sensors on all the shocks on all the cars that we have. Race cars got temp in it, the pre-runners got temp in it, and everything we've ever had, we can see what the shock temps are because we're always testing and tuning. But going through San Felipe, the shocks got over 300 degrees, and we had it sounded like a small M80 going off in the back. And what it was losing all the nitrogen pressure out of the shock. When the shock failed, back at camp, we found out that the head of the shock had unthreaded and the body had threaded apart and blew the seal right out of the top of the shock, and that's because the Loctite went at 300 degrees. So we put the shock back together, put oil in it, and pre-ran for another 3 days. But other things that had happened is the plastic spring divider that separates the upper and lower spring, sliding up and down on the shock body when it was that hot, had actually melted the divider, and that divider had put plastic inside all of the threads of the shock body and made it a smooth plastic body, and that divider had squirted plastic out the sides of the springs. So you just start having failures when you get that hot. Now in racing, you can see those temps. What creates temp? That's very complicated, but ultimately it's friction. And it's friction not between, there is some friction between, say, the shaft and seals, between the piston and the body of the shock. Those have friction, but the majority of friction I'm talking about is gaining heat through friction of fluid. So that fluid has to pass through ports in the piston, it has to go around valving, it has to go through bypass ports on the sides, it has to make 90-degree turns around fittings and make its way down hoses to reservoirs and come back. Okay, those turns and rubbing against things as it passes through them creates heat. That friction is where the temp of the shock gains the most. And a lot of people think that if they go driving down a rough road, it's got rocks on it, or it's got washboard in it, and the shock is just moving super fast and the tires are dancing super fast, that's what creates heat because it's moving fast. That's actually not true. Heat comes from cycling the most amount of oil from the bottom to the top of the shock in one fluid motion. So if it's just sitting there dancing, the piston and shaft is dancing inside the oil, that doesn't create much heat. You're not moving very much oil. But if you have a fully extended shock that completely compresses all the way through, comes all the way out fully extended and completely compresses all the way through, that full stroke over and over and over again is where most of the temperature comes from. So through the whoops, if the whoops are a foot tall, for hours on end, probably won't overheat shocks. You go through San Felipe where the whoops could be 3 feet tall and you can't go through there very fast, and the car is completely compressed, and then it's completely unloaded, and it's completely compressed again. That full stroke over and over is where heat comes from. So in races, we monitor the temps. We see temp in San Felipe coming up to 260, 270, 280. We'll try and drive off the side of the trail and kind of slow down a little bit and get that temp back down to 260, and then we'll rip it and get it up to 280, and then we'll slow down a little bit and kind of manage those temperatures because you don't want the shock coming apart. Your race is over. You're smiling, Chase, which means you're reading comments or you want to sign on somebody, don't you?
Yeah, I was smiling about nothing here. Don't worry about what I was smiling about.
Am I touching it all the time?
No, it was more so I forgot to do the tip trick right here at the get-go.
Touch the tip. Thank you for managing my tip, Chase.
Good job, Chase.
And I was just, saying, nobody likes, you need to have all types of strokes, not just big, long strokes.
Different strokes, actually, Chase.
Different strokes for different folks.
That's right. So, Mitch, you got some good questions before I
have a real question here.
A real one? Is it yours?
No, it's from Mikey Williams, 33. How often should the oil be changed in the factory shocks?
So the question is, how hard do you run your car? Because if you are if you're just playing around like most people do, then you shouldn't have to change the oil ever. We recommend that you rebuild the shocks every 2,500 to 4,500 miles according to how you run the shock, or if it leaks. Typically, oil hasn't degraded unless you've gotten the shock hot. Now, oil quality is a big deal. You can fade a walker pretty easily, mainly not because of the walker design, but mainly because of the oil. And I would suggest that you change the oil in walkers a lot faster than anything else. But if we've gotten inside of it, we've done a rebuild for you, we've got the best oil made, you're not going to have any oil issues. Rebuild the shocks if they leak. On the oil subject though, so low quality oil can actually burn under temperature. It will change function. It will actually fade, the word fade, with temp a lot quicker than an older oil or a better oil will do. So from a comparison standpoint, you can buy Walker oil for 30 bucks a gallon. You can buy King oil for $40 a gallon. You can buy Fox oil for $50 a gallon. The full synthetic oil that we run is $110 a gallon. So to us, it's worth having a more quality oil so you never have a problem with shock fade, you never have a problem with the oil degrading. Behind you, Chase, is a good example. So this typically is how oil looks when you're putting it in it. Most of the oils in shocks are basically a hydraulic oil, just depends on what weight. There are different grades and qualities of oil in hydraulic oil and shock oil. This is oil that's brand new. Okay, this is the same oil after it's been overheated or run at about 260 or 70 degrees in somebody else's race car that we just did. So this is broken down, it has no viscosity qualities anymore. This oil right here is actually the oil that we run, and I don't have an example for you, but this is basically what it looks like when we pull it out of our race car after a race. So we don't have any breakdown issues, we don't have any burning issues, and this changes exactly how the two shocks are going to function. I mean, you can take a look at one that's destroyed and one that's fine, and you're going to know how the shocks are going to work in your car. So, not sure, I might have gone a little bit too deep on the oil change issue. Probably rebuild your shocks a lot quicker than you should change oil if you got the right oil. What do you got, man?
George Kane wants to know, can it be too cold for shocks?
No, the only problem when you run shocks cold is they're typically going to be stiffer, so the ride quality is going to be worse. You're not going to hurt the shock. There's nothing inside of a shock that is going to be temperature specific, like say wall clearance. Like in an engine, piston to wall clearance, you need to have that right. If it's cold, you can hurt the engine. If it's hot, you can hurt the engine. In a shock, it's not that tall. The tolerances aren't that tight, so you don't have that issue. Just rides rough. Anything else?
Steve O'Knievel, is the face on Shock Therapy's logo the face of previously known as Dyno Jet Matt's face?
Oh, that looks pretty good, actually. If you had your tongue out in that one race car video, it wouldn't be that far off, huh, Matt?
Don't worry,
Right?
I'll work on superimposing his face on the shocky.
Speaking of Matt, we're going to have a name choice for Matt probably by the end of the week, you guys. You're still coming up with some pretty good names, so we're letting it go. Mitch?
Mega Desert Diesel, what do you use for temp probe and placement?
So temperature probe is an infrared sensor. Typically we go with the more accurate, expensive ones like from AIM. And I think we're using the AIM sensor, right, on our system right now, which is extremely accurate. We usually, actually come around here, Chase, I can show you on this side. We've got sensor on this one, right, Tony?
Right where you're going.
Yep. So look up in here, Chase. That box, you guys, right here, that's an infrared probe. We made a mount that strapped onto the shock and keeps the probe just off of it. It's aiming an infrared signal onto the body. Now, we temperature probe shocks, usually at the head of the shock. Most like Fox RC2s or any shock style like a Walker, where you've got a needle or a secondary piston or a dual piston cup like a King, develops heat in the head of the shock. Technically, an internal bypass shock develops more heat at the seal head where the shaft comes out of the main body, more so than the head. But for us, we can't put a temp probe there with a coil spring in the way, so we're always temperaturing something up at the head of the shock. Matt?
Mandrew Peterson wants to know, will going through water and rapidly cooling shocks after running your shocks hard at high temperature damage them?
So it's a good question, and you would think that from an engineering standpoint it would hurt them, but we've done that 1,000 times and it never has. We've taken shocks apart after races where they're absolutely smoked and we go through water crossings and haven't seen any damage on the inside. No piston wall damage or any kind of seizing or warping that was worth even talking about. How about seals? Until Mitch comes up with another cool question. Oh my God. Does he... is he really even part of our crew? I mean, everybody around here is just laughing because we put up with that.
Justin, I want to say that your guys' probe looks a lot different than the probe I have at home, as well as Jake Barner would like to say, prove that this is not KY jelly.
Good question. I can't prove it. Actually, Chase might.
Don't worry, I'll prove it.
Yeah, he probably will. He'll drop trowel and show you.
Watch the stories later on. I'll prove it.
All right. So seals. Seals that come in shocks factory are a standardized system. Typically, you can tell whether a seal is more high quality according to whether it's soft to the touch or whether it's more rigid or even downright hard. The higher quality, when it comes to shocks, this isn't the case on all seals, but when it comes to shocks, typically the higher temperature range of seal also means it's going to have a more harder feel to it or durometer. So this is a standard seal that comes in an OEM shock for the shaft, and also a wiper pressure and dust seal. This is kind of what you see in a Walker. Easy, small, typical O-ring type stuff. There is a mid-grade seal. These are good, believe it or not, to about 200 degrees, and that's it. Now, how do you run a shock at 220 degrees and not have these seals fail? Because typically the shock is hotter at the head of the shock than it is at the shaft. So the seals can see 180 degrees when the top of the shock might be 230 degrees, so you don't usually lose them. There's a mid-grade seal. This one happens to be one of ours, that's why it's red. But this mid-grade seal is good to 260 degrees. 260 degrees means that you'd have a shock almost 300 degrees at the head of the shock when the shaft seal is at 260. We run this seal in every single shock we rebuild. They're a lot more money. For instance, these seals as a complete rebuild kit, about 12 to 15 bucks. This style of seal as a complete rebuild kit, about $30. So this is typical and standard for us. This is a Viton seal. It's a custom made seal that we have made for us. And we get Viton seals for every shock made. A lot of shocks actually don't have them. We do this standard in any race shock or race team that we're dealing with. And these are good to over 300 degrees. So you're not gonna melt these seals before you actually have Loctite melting on the shock. A Viton seal kit would be about 75 bucks per shock. That's standard for us when it comes to race teams. So seals are super important if you start running stuff really hard. Now, what we get a lot of, go ahead and, why don't you guys bring that up to like, say like 160. So, at 15 Chase or 30?
We're about 20.
Okay.
20 in.
So what the guys are doing is they're gonna heat up the shock body to about, say, 260. I'm sorry, 160. You got about 160? What do you got?
Coming down. It's like 180.
180? Okay, 180, I can keep my hand on that. A second, maybe a second and a half. Maybe not a second and a half, probably somewhere between a half a second and a second. Okay, 180 right there. Most people that are playing with their cars are gonna tell us, that's overheated and it's working too hard. It hasn't even begun to work. It's not even something that you should worry about. Bring that to like 240. So 240 is in the upper range of a play car's, temperature, but it's certainly within the range of any shock that we've ever rebuilt because of the seals and the oil. You good? All right. That is boiling right off my finger. And just a little bit of water. So we definitely have gotten to that point. Now this right here, where are you at, Darren? Probably 200 on the water.
Yep.
Yep, I can keep my hand on it for half a second. Okay, this right here is what you can expect in a play car if you try to touch it. Boiling water, barely being able to put your fingers on it, that's operating temperature. Completely fine. And you're gonna find that on the rear shocks of a lot of UTVs because you've got a lot of engine temperature around that, and the rear shocks see a lot more weight and have to deal with that, which also develops friction and temp. Put that up to 300. So 300 degrees, since we've actually done that in a race and do that when we pre-run, is easy to know where 300 is. And I'll tell you why. Because the water doesn't even boil. The water bounces right off of it. It's not even gonna touch it. It doesn't stay on it, it's gone. So we've done this actually in a bone stock XP Pro in San Felipe. Untouched, just our spring kit, and that's it. We've gotten it that hot and melted everything on that system and blew the shock wide open from a seal and a seal cap standpoint, just to find out how far they'll go. So I wouldn't recommend touching that. I have a story about that. We were pre-running again in San Felipe. We were in a class 1 pre-runner with external bypass shocks on it, actually Kings. And we stopped for a beer after about 100 miles of whoops in San Felipe. And we noticed that the stickers on the back of the shocks had turned brown. That King sticker was no longer white and blue, but just smoked right off. And one of the guys grabbed a beer and he leaned up against the tire, and we're all having a good story, and he leaned back and touched the reservoir on that bypass and left his shirt melted, and he left skin on the bypass. Now, we didn't even think that that was a problem. We're running the car and it's perfectly fine. So hot, when I say hot on a shock, I mean really, 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 really hot. So you think it's hot if you can touch it, if you can even keep your finger near it for ever, it's not too hot. It's not too hot until water dances off of it, then you have issues. You guys got any more questions?
The 11 Princess 11, have you guys ever tried using electric cooling pads on your shocks?
Not electric cooling pads. The reason is it's a lot easier to run airflow to it. So a lot of people have asked us what these NACA ducts are on our car. Well, this is really simple. It just runs a hose of air to the head of the shock. So if you follow this around, we've just got cooling to the shock. So that's super simple. It doesn't require electrical power, it's not expensive, and typically that's all that's needed on most of these. As long as you have airflow to the rears, then they're gonna have no issues. The problem arises if you're driving 25 miles an hour and you're not getting much air by the shock, or not enough airflow, and you're completely compressing and extending through the whoops for miles and miles and miles and just completely stroking the system, you can overheat it because you don't have enough airflow. But in UTVs, there's not much power to deal with or not much power available, so electronic cooling would be a bitch.
Justin, like my RC cars and like all those big bad trophy trucks out there, how come we don't see heat sinks on our shocks on the UTVs?
So they actually make them. If you look at a King reservoir, they've got finned reservoirs that will cool better. But there's always a but when it comes to this stuff. So remote reservoirs, people think, are better for cooling because you can put the remote somewhere up into the air. And from a heat transfer standpoint, yeah, it's going to cool off the reservoir a lot better by doing that. The problem is that the amount of oil that gets out of the shock down that hose to the reservoir is equal to the shaft diameter and length. So typically on the rear of this, you're going to find that's a 14-inch travel shaft, 7/8 in diameter. So that means only 7/8 of oil, diameter oil, by 14 inches long is making its way down this hose. Well, it actually never makes it to the reservoir. Oil only gets about halfway down this hose and never makes it in here and mixes up and makes its way back down the hose. So if you temp gun a reservoir on a remote system, you'll find the reservoirs are going to be 120 degrees and the shock's 280 degrees because it just takes forever for it to try and mix the oil. The best system, honestly, is a piggyback because now you don't have a hose extending the two. The reservoir is right on the shock, so 14 inches, for instance, of 7/8 oil is going into the reservoir and coming back all the time. It's always mixing, so you have better cooling. The negative to that is typically a piggyback is going to be on the shock right next to the motor where it's already hot. So you don't get good cooling because of the surrounding temperature. Back to airflow. You're never going to find a front shock overheating in a UTV because it's got plenty of air. It's seeing the same terrain as the rear. It may not see the same weight. The rears are typically what overheats because of everything around it and it has no airflow. So if you can literally just pull some air into that shock area and maybe convert things to a piggyback, it'll run way, way, way cooler. Fox developed what's called a cactus cooler for trophy trucks. It was developed strictly for San Felipe. That was it, because trophy trucks would overheat bypasses all day. And what that is a remote reservoir where they could put finned reservoir in the airflow, but it has two hoses and they're directional with one-way valves in it, one going in and one going out. So every time it's compressed, oil moves one direction and it makes one big circle. Just doesn't sit there inside the hose. Problem is they haven't built a cactus cooler system for UTVs yet. There are some prototypes out there. I think Monster Matt with a Monster sponsored car has a set that he got out of the race division and made. I think there's a second set available I saw, and Fox is looking at making that actually for us here shortly, so we might have cactus cooler abilities on UTVs coming, but it doesn't exist yet. Matt? Or Mitch?
I'm looking through here. To the 11 Process 11. Sorry, your name is Process, not Princess. My bad, man.
Process, not Princess. I thought Princess was pretty good, though.
Yeah,
I was gonna go with that.
Quick.
My bad. My
I
bad.
did say Princess, so now you're stepping up, Chase?
I got a live one here. Jason Cole, what's going on, brother?
How's it going?
Going well, man. Where are you at? What are you driving, and what's your question?
I'm in San Diego. I'm driving an X3. I'm thinking about getting your spring kit real fast. My question is, on your raced X3 right behind you, Justin, I see you modified the clutch cover with an extra hose. What's the purpose of that?
So we are...
Sorry,
All right, go ahead. Second question.
The second question, I keep reading in the forums, which people keep saying flip their front reservoirs out for whatever reason, because they say the radiator overheats the bypass. Is that true?
So I'll do your second question first. Flipping the reservoir does absolutely nothing. It might actually change a couple of degrees, so there is a measurable something that gives you an advantage, but in reality you're never going to feel it. It's not something you're going to notice. And no, the radiator is not overheating the shock. So if you had 200 degree air coming out of the back of the radiator, or even 220 degree air coming back out of that radiator onto the shock's perfectly happy at 220 degrees. It's not overheating yet. It's not going to fade at that point. You flip the reservoir, it might run a little bit cooler, but you're talking 5 degrees, nothing worth even mentioning. Also, you get a lot of airflow inside that hood area, even though the radiator is running hot air in there. And that 220 degree air out of the back of the fan, by the time it's mixed, is probably more like 180 degrees. So, hey, I would do it if you like the look. That's pretty much it. You know, other than that, it's not going to give you a performance advantage. First question, on the clutch cover. So we are always looking for an advantage when it comes to clutch or belt temp, because it is the one thing we fight all the time. If you start making 300 horsepower in your car and you pin it and never lift and go up in altitude, or say Vegas to Reno coming up where it's going to be 110 degrees and we are running pinned at 95 miles an hour or more at all times, belt temps are an issue. So we're looking for more of an advantage. We actually have an electric fan to that second hose. So this one is the one you're talking about. This actually has an electric motor on top of it. I am sorry, but I'm not going to give you the manufacturer of that fan. That's something we want to keep amongst ourselves. But I will tell you that it is a brushless motor. It is computer controlled, and it flows a ridiculous amount of air, like 2,500 CFM out of a 4-inch fan. It draws a massive amount of amperage, so you have to run an alternator to run that fan. Any inline fans that we've seen as a kit do not flow nearly enough. They're like 240 CFM, 300, 400, 600 CFM. That is a restriction to the factory flow rate of the stock clutch. The stock clutch is way in excess of 4,000 CFM when it's pumping air just by spinning at about 7,500 to 8,000 RPM. So even our fan does nothing if this is floored. The only time our fan helps is the second you back off the throttle, and it actually will pump more airflow than the clutch is pumping, and it kind of drops temperatures when you're off the throttle and helps us. But if you're floored at 100 mile an hour on a lake bed, our fan does nothing. It's just about when you're on and off the throttle. So hopefully that answers your question. You got it, man. How about a t-shirt color and size, and we'll see if Chase sends it to you. Right on, man. Have a good one. San Diego. That sounds like better temperatures than it is here right now.
Yeah.
Although we are in AC.
Here we are. The Diesel Dog 379, what about thermodynamic flow?
Well, what do you mean by thermodynamic flow? I mean, you're talking about the differences in the flow rates because of temperatures? If that's the case, maybe expand on your question a little bit, okay?
I'll let you know.
Joshua Martin, do sealed gas shocks wear out the same way?
Sealed gas shocks, do they wear out?
The same way.
The same way? Yes, but when you say sealed gas, you mean something that's maybe not rebuildable? I'm not really sure what we're... so I'm assuming if it's sealed gas, you're talking about a welded can that doesn't have the ability to change or charge it with nitrogen. They're always going to wear out quick. That's a very cheap shock. Sealed gas, if you're talking about something like that's rebuildable like these, but you can charge with nitrogen, completely different animal, much better shock, not going to wear out with anything unless you completely melt it down. I'm not sure really what he's had to say either on that one. Matt or Mitch?
Mega Desert Diesel, what about the Can-Am DS passenger rear shock reservoir close to the exhaust? Anything they can do to keep heat away or not a concern?
I would love to see more exhaust temp pulled away from the shock, so a heat shield is a really good thing. But I also think you might find that the surface temperature of the reservoir where it's close to the exhaust might be 200 or 300 degrees at the resi can. But if you temp gun the rest of the shock, you'll find out that the oil is never that hot. So I don't think that exhaust overheats. It does cause the passenger side to run warmer, but it's not going to overheat it versus the other side not overheating. It's not going to be that drastic.
We got Mark on the line here. Mark, what's going on, brother? Where are you at? What are you driving? And what's your question?
Well, I'm in Las Vegas, and it's hotter now.
Yep, hot here too.
2017 XP Turbo, I'd like to show it, but unfortunately, it's in the shop. Quite with an external or extended warranty company. A couple of shows ago, you had mentioned that extended warranty woes. And I'm on the deal right now. It's been in the shop for 2 weeks. Fighting these guys.
I'm sorry you're dealing with that, man. We've seen it a lot. They want to blame everything on something that has nothing to do with the problem just to get out of it.
Well, it's the oversized tire excuse this time.
Oh, that's the excuse. Okay, because no one does that.
The fact that you can buy the unit with those tires.
With those tires? Yeah.
The actual tires I use carry a Polaris part number, which makes even more bizarre.
Man, stick it to them. I hate it when they do that stuff.
Yeah, well, I've got the Carter Motorsports here in Las Vegas that are giving me a hand here.
Good.
So they're helping me out. Question is this is an IQS question. I don't know, I popped in to talk about temperature, which is something I wanted to talk to you about. Shock temperatures. When I ride aggressively up in Utah, I stop and adjust. And I noticed my cylinders are like way hot, and I'm just curious how that affects performance. And I know you probably repeat everything that you've already said up into this late, but my question was IQS related. The 3 steps of IQS, low, firm, and hard, or whatever it is, on a Fox shop where you got like 24 steps, would that be equivalent of 0, 12, and 24?
It is.
Steps?
Yeah, it is exactly that. But I'm going to tell you that the IQS adjuster flows about 15% more oil in both directions. So it would be the same as a Fox compression adjuster from 0 to 24 if you could go -10 and +30. It actually it'll go softer than your adjuster, and it will go stiffer than your adjuster, but the middle setting will still be 12, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Now on my shocks, I got the Fox package on mine, but I don't have the high and low adjustment. I just got the one.
So that means you got 3 clicker on there, you know, low, medium, and high on your shock too?
No, well, I got 4 steps.
4 steps. 24 steps. So you still have it. You have a normal high-speed adjuster. You just don't have the low speed in it.
Right.
Okay.
How can I tweak on the low speed with that setup? Just the keepers or the shock package?
It's internal. Without the adjuster externally, you have no ability to change that without getting inside the shock. So it's going to be a combination of valving and or free bleed holes or free bleed shims in the piston are going to control, or flutter shim in the piston or on the piston is going to control low speed. But on your adjuster, you're not going to get that.
My shocks are my springs are collapsed, so it's time to come to you guys and get some springs. But I got to deal with this warranty issue first because if they stick me with the bill, it's not going to be a pretty sight.
Yeah.
But where I ride up in Utah, some of these logging roads have these rocks and stuff on them, which below would grate like a really on that to kind of dampen some of that. And then I obviously want to be on and play in the sand, but that's kind of where I did. I don't know if you do any of the type of riding you know. You know, you got trail, but they're littered with these rocks and temperatures. And it's brutal.
Yep, I've been. So with the adjuster you have, you don't have that option. You can do an adjuster option though, or you can upgrade from what you've got to a DSC or a dual speed. I think you're going to see a bigger advantage though if we actually get inside and play with the shock. We can modify the internals to give you the low speed that's not going to abruptly smack you in the butt when you see those rocks and stuff, where you're not going to have that harshness from the internal mods and still not sacrifice or even possibly gain, you know, bottom out resistance. Internal modifications are going to be the biggest mod in what you're talking about. The adjuster mechanism is just going to let you tweak it a little bit. So we might be, like a good example, we might make a 100% change in low speed, whereas the adjuster will give you a 15 or 20% adjustment range. We're just going on the stellar direction for plush. So when it comes to IQS, you won't have the adjustment in low speed, like details, but we will have already done the internals to get you that plush ride internally. And when you turn the IQS from soft, medium to hard, it is changing the high speed as well as the low speed as it goes up. So the car will be a firmer, maybe you're going to feel a little bit more rocks when you get it on the stiff side, but on the soft side, it's going to be super plush for rocks. Hopefully that answers your question, I guess.
Yeah, it does. I'm just trying to figure out where I'm going to spend my money and be smart about it.
So from a ride quality standpoint, do springs and internal shock mods. That is your best bang for the buck. IQS is not going to make it ride amazing. IQS is going to give you the adjustability to turn it up and down on the fly. But will it turn up and down on the fly a harsh riding system? Or is it going to turn up and down on the fly a plush and bitchin' riding system? So I would do the internals in the spring kit before I did IQS. That will give you the biggest bang for the buck.
But if I went that direction, that'd be a disadvantage with everybody without saying you mod.
No. So when we do the internals in the spring, it's going to perform better in all directions. So you could have the trail riding plushness that you need so you don't feel the rocks. You can turn it up to say 12, 14, 16 clicks and you have enough bottom out resistance and also stability for round whoops and dunes and geos. That's really what we try to tune for, is those two opposites in the system. So again, I would suggest you do the internals and I would do the spring. It's going to give you the range you need.
Now I reached out on instant messaging asking if there's anybody local, and I gave it to Ride Now or something. I gave them a call and asked them if they could comment on giving me the low and the high speed adjustability, and they kind of drew a blank on the phone. So I'm just wondering if they're just not up to speed or
So Ride Now is a dealer for us, but all their individual sales guys aren't trained on the details. They're gonna let you know, hey, spring kits are gonna ride better and give you ride height. They're gonna give you that kind of simple information. Always call us for those details. Call us at 623-217-4959. Talk to the guys up front. They'll give you all the little stuff that you're gonna want, and that way you can make your decision even better, especially from the detail standpoint of how you're driving your car. Right on, man? Give us...
I always like to go to you guys, but I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, we can help you out. Give us a t-shirt size and a color. We'll send it to you.
Appreciate it. Thanks. Keep up the good work, guys.
Thanks, man. Have a good one. All right, with that,
Thank
we're
you. You
probably
too.
gonna
Bye.
wrap this up. You guys got any good questions?
Let's do rapid fire question with Mitch.
Palmer Motorsports. I have a 19 X3 Turbo Double R. I have all the shock therapy sway bars and links, front and rear. After putting the front on the suspension to seem... Adding your springs changes the ride on a 1 to 10 standpoint.
4 to 5. Spring kits are about a 4 to 5 on a scale of 1 to 10. Internal shock modifications are about a 5 or a 6. If you put the two together, that gets you a 10. Matt, questions? Nothing. Facebook. Awesome. Lost Facebook. That's because
They did.
Chase
Hold
is
on.
killing it.
Hold on. They did want to say Facebook had one thing. They wanted to see Matt and I arm wrestle.
That was Whole Friday.
Okay. Cole asked for that, so maybe on Throw It Out There Thursday we'll have an arm wrestle.
Thursday, don't worry. I'll bring my mask.
All right, no more questions because we got nothing easy. You guys, thank you very much for tuning in. Appreciate it. Sorry to cut you off. It's 45 minutes, but for some reason, Chase cannot figure out why a GoPro will not go longer than 45 minutes on Facebook.
I mean,
so we are forced to cut things short because of Chase. Thank you so much, Chase. If you guys have questions about our products, go and call us. Just like the customer who just signed on and was asking all those questions, we will answer all those questions for you on the phone, 623-217-4959. And if you guys want to buy any parts or maybe get some internal work done so that your shocks do not overheat, then go to our website, shocktherapist.com. You guys have a great week. See you for Throw It Out There Thursday.